Thank you so much. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are joining this event. Allow me first to thank our friends at Enterprise Singapore for hosting this event and inviting my panelists and I. Whilst we would all have preferred to visit Singapore, it was on my annual to-do list. The fact that such a distinguished panel of speakers has been assembled and the large audience in attendance is testament both to the quality of the event and the power of growing online communities and events. My name is Kareem Ajawala. I am a lawyer based in Nairobi, and I'm the managing partner of ALN Kenya, Ajawala and Khanna. I work across the continent, helping clients navigating their most complex opportunities when investing in Africa. We've also been involved deeply in advising on the urban build-out in multiple cities in Africa. In the information already provided, there is substantial data about our panelists, so I will not take up the limited time we have with detailed introductions. However, as I was reflecting and preparing for this panel, I realized how uniquely well placed they are to speak on the issues of urbanization and sustainability. So allow me a few words to set the scene. Umar, through his work as CEO of Meinhardt Group, the largest privately held engineering firm in Asia, has a unique insight on how to urbanize and bring technology and smart city solutions to bear, reflecting particularly on experiences across Asia and MENA in particular. What is unique about Rolake, Raghav, and Giles as a combination is that each of them brings rich experience from outside Africa, but are now all developing the urban landscape literally across West, North, East, and South Africa. Rolake, with Mixter, is focused currently on West and North Africa, including in one of Africa's megacities, Lagos, on the Lagos New Town project. Raghav, as CEO of Acorn Holdings, is dealing with probably the most pressing problem in Eastern Africa's urban landscape, building tens of thousands of units of affordable housing for young people, and in doing so, has raised the first ever green bond from East Africa, which is also listed in the UK, and has also used a REIT as a financing and liquidity tool. Giles has had 20 odd years of his career focused on smart and sustainable master plan city scale developments, and is currently as CDO of Attack, spearheading Waterfall City, a new master plan city between Johannesburg and Pretoria on a 2,200 hectare site. And as Giles has said, as we're preparing for this event, he puts data at the heart of his development agenda. Let me quickly set the scene about urbanization in Africa. I mean, it's no news to you all that Africa is the fastest urbanizing continent in the world. Its urbanization rate exceeds 45%, but there are big differences across regions and countries. And one of the points that our panelists will no doubt make is that local knowledge is essential. According to the McKinsey Global Institute, every year until 2045, Africa will add 24 million people to its cities. There are now over 50 cities with a population exceeding 1 million, with Lagos, Cairo, and Kinshasa all megacities, with a number of others such as Abidjan, Dar es Salaam, Johannesburg, and Nairobi heading in that direction. With rising urbanization comes higher GDP per capita. Africa's urban GDP is almost 3 times higher than rural GDP. There are, of course, also massive challenges. It can be argued that what has happened in KwaZulu-Natal recently, including Johannesburg, Durban, and Pietermaritzburg, was an example, at least in part, of a failure of urbanization. And it should not be forgotten that the spark of the Arab Spring was in Tunis. Climate change and the increasing mechanization of agriculture are other push factors in relation to urbanization and bring a sense of urgency to the debate about how urbanization in Africa must work. On the other hand, some of the most exciting developments in renewable energy are in Africa. The development of large-scale wind, geothermal, solar, and hydropower projects. Across Africa, fintech developments are moving at speed, attracting venture capital globally, and many of them are dealing head-on with the challenges of urbanization, whether in financial inclusion, logistics, or transportation. Swivel is a great example. An Egyptian-founded company has just announced its listing on the NASDAQ, a unicorn dealing with mass transport solutions for emerging markets, particularly in megacities. The level and rate of internet penetration has accelerated greatly, but with significant differences between countries and regions. Companies such as Liquid Telecom are working hard to deal with equalizing this and dealing with last mile access. Data available is all pre-COVID, after which there has again been exponential change. But by way of example, there are 103 mobile subscriptions for every 100 people in Kenya. On the financing front, the AFDB has mobilized $12 billion recently to support sustainable development projects. Ultimately, though, technology, financing, development partners, and a vibrant private sector are essential to positive urbanization outcomes, but most importantly, strategic planning and governance will be key. So, with that introduction, ladies and gentlemen, allow me to turn to our panelists, and I'll direct my first opening question to Omar. Omar, climate change and COVID-19 have fundamentally transformed how we think about urbanization and sustainability. Singapore is probably the world's leading example of smart city planning. However, there are also more, how can I say, relatable examples from Southeast Asia, such as from Vietnam. What are some of the experiences in Asia's rollout of smart cities that you can share with Africa as various countries now think about smart city implementation? And what role can Asian companies play working hand in hand with Africa? Over to you, Omar.
Thank you, Kareem, and it's great to be part of this exciting event and this panel. I think when you look at smart cities, I think the fundamentals really start with good planning. And the planning is about urban planning. You know, where do you locate the industries, the offices, the retail, the residential components when you look at a smart city? But really, we think that the backbone of any smart city boils down to the infrastructure. And for us, that includes 3 or 4 parameters. One is, the services. That's primarily the utilities, power, water, electricity, power, water, telecoms. You have security. You have mobility. We mentioned a little bit about last mile connectivity. That's also very important. And I think in Africa, that aspect needs sprucing up. And obviously, on top of all this sits the ICT pillar, which, depending on how smart the whole precinct or city is going to be, talks about big data, artificial intelligence, but really ICT is important, connecting the various pillars that I just talked about as far as infrastructure is concerned. You're right, Singapore is quite advanced in this game, along with cities in China, Hong Kong, but Southeast Asia, India are rolling out numerous smart cities. And again, I believe the first layer is good planning, backed up by good infrastructure. And the third element to this, Kareem, is the technology aspect to it. Now, generally, the perception may be that technology is very expensive. It doesn't have a business case, and it may not be so relevant in emerging economies. Our experience has shown that actually the technology layer is not that expensive. Usually, depending on how smart, whether it's a 4.0 or what aspiration you have in the blueprint. And again, this can be done in the planning phase. You're looking at about 5% of the overall project cost. And most of the smart city solutions we're talking about have a business case. There's a payback period. A lot of these solutions can be handled by the private sector if proper structuring of those projects is done. So we believe that even if you don't implement those solutions on day one, you should have a plan for this, a provision for these services, and then those can be rolled out perhaps when there's critical mass. So again, I think if you look at some of the smart cities that are coming out in Southeast Asia, good infrastructure is a key component, but also having the right layer of smart city solutions ranging from 5G rollout, for example, as far as telecom is concerned, a command and control center to implement smart parking or smart lighting solutions. Those all have a valid business case, and those are all relevant in the context of Africa as well.
Great, thank you, Omar. Giles, when we were preparing, I know you stressed the importance to you of how you use data in the master planning that you're doing around Waterfall. You just want to come back on what Omar said and maybe share your insights in the South African context.
Yeah, thank you. I tend to agree wholeheartedly with Omar's assessment. I mean, we've rolled out a the first phase, call it 30% of a 2,500 hectare smart city. We were very focused upfront on infrastructure and sizing infrastructure to full capacity. And that included pipes, cables, and roads. So everything went in the ground at full scale. You try and get that one past the accountants and your investment committee that you're oversizing everything. But we're seeing the benefits now because we don't go back and dig anything up. So we plug and play buildings now very easily. We've got a redundant, the fiber line that runs around the entire city has a double redundancy. So it's very easy for us to plug and play. And what we are doing is we're learning. So the infrastructure absolutely is critical to get it. You cannot piecemeal your way to a smart city. I think you have to start with the bigger picture and you have to bite the bullet up front. The second thing is the data we're harvesting is actually incredible. So we have data, everything from your normal building BMS data through to we've installed a scientific grade weather station. So now we map weather data, we map building data, we map traffic data. We have number plate recognition and facial data within the city. We now map and track MAC addresses on cell phones. And what that allows us to do is to actually see where people use our city. So looking at it on a grid, we can in real time map in every single phone that comes in. And we don't know the number or the person of the phone, but the technology allows us to map that 3 or 4G signal that pings every 30 seconds or 15 seconds, depending on your settings on your phone, and allows us to see where people come and go, how long they spend, in what order do they look at things. So at the heart of Waterfall is a 130,000 square meter super regional shopping center, approximately 500 stores. We can see what entrance you come in, where do you park, which toilets you use, which shops you go to in which particular order, what is your dwell time. And that data, overlaying with traffic data, traffic light data, building data, builds us a large data set that allows us strategically to start. The next building is basically a sum of all the lessons learned and all the data harvested from the previous building. So, in essence, we're building our own data set. And even funny enough, we've discovered our weather files are different from the ASHRAE files for the city of Johannesburg. So the city of Johannesburg's official weather data centers at the airport. It's about 30 kilometers from us. Since we've installed our scientific weather station, we've got different wind speeds, we've got different wind directions, and we actually have different thermal days. So what that says is we're designing buildings based on a generic set of data from Johannesburg as a city, yet our subset of data actually says something different. And it's now starting to evolve to a point where in using our own data, we've achieved our first net zero office building, carbon net zero. And if we'd use the ASHRAE weather files, and there's nothing wrong with ASHRAE weather files, it's just saying that the files are generic for Johannesburg, and yet our data set is very particular. We probably wouldn't have achieved the net zero because we would have over-designed or overcompensated for things that weren't really an issue for us. So absolutely, infrastructure is critical. You can't do anything without it. Infrastructure, bite the bullet, do it at scale. You don't want to come back. It's very difficult to upgrade, as you can see. To upgrade a road is one thing. To upgrade a pipe is another thing. To upgrade your infrastructure backbone becomes the hardest of the lot. And localize your data set and harvest as much data as possible, because all your future decisions are absolutely going to be based on the historical data sets.
Giles, thanks very much. I think maybe we just need to go back a little bit, and I want you to talk about the why of Waterfall City. Okay, just explain to the audience kind of the overarching logic for what drove it, and I want you to talk a little bit about power and how you're thinking about power for this obviously massive endeavor.
Yeah, so I mean, 2,500 hectares is a very large piece of land. It's midway between Johannesburg and Pretoria, which are two cities in a district of around 12 million people. This land was left undeveloped for over 100 years, purely because the land, just a quick background, the land sat in an Islamic trust, which could not sell the land. So it sat sort of fallow, unable to open it up for development. 20 odd years ago, the banks started getting their head around a leasehold sort of idea, very similar to as when Dubai was starting to think about leasehold. How do you open up land for sale, but it's not necessarily transferring the land, you're transferring the rights to the land. The land always remains with the landowner. Once that the banks have got their head around that, because remember, a bank holds a title deed, but it's not necessarily a title deed. The bank's just holding the lease. It's not holding the land. It opened up a massive master plan developer. We sit on the N1 freeway, so that's the busiest freeway in the Southern Hemisphere linking these two cities. And we are equidistant between the CBDs of both, and Mid-Rand is essentially midway between the two cities. So it started with a large master plan that covers all asset classes. So we have a large industrial precinct of about 2.5 million square meters, and then all the way to a new town center, and then surrounded with typical suburban residential suburbs. So that's sort of the bigger picture. And then we've been at it 12 years. I've been on the hot seat nearly the last 4 years. In the last 4 years, we've developed 70% of the city, and in the previous 8 years, we did 30% of the city. So our acceleration is growing. We have approximately 1,200 residential units under construction, and that's from apartments through to mega houses in an equestrian estate. But it's fully mixed use. The idea is that it's a smart and sustainable city. Primarily, our focus on the CBD part of it. Whilst we do all of it, the CBD is our baby. And that's a walkable, safe, functional city, encouraging people to have the best of all worlds, everything from motorized transport to mass public transport. All the buildings are architecturally designed to complement each other. Every building is green certified. And then that has led us now to the ongoing problems of power and utilities. Is we are now in the process, and we're going through that process with the local regulators of actually buying the local network and grid back from the utility provider, being Eskom, and to create a microgrid with a generation license. And we don't want to get into generating of power. I think we want to get into the transmission of power. We want to be the network operator, and we want to transmit power between everybody, every house who puts a solar panel on their roof, to every office block that has hydrogen packs. Everyone becomes a source of power, its own substation or its own power station, and then we just wheel power between various organizations. So spare capacity at a residential house, feed into the grid at, call it one rand per kilowatt hour, and we would sell it to the neighbor or to the mall or whatever at 2. You don't know where your power comes from at the end of the day, so we pay the network provider, because power, and unfortunately for us down south, water is going to become an absolute critical driver of growth and development. I mean, we're already predicting water rationing coming in under a severe event in less than 5 years, and that's purely because of the rate of urbanization equals, the rain hasn't changed its patterns, but we've got more people living in a drier area. So over time, we will eventually run out of water. Power we can make, it's relatively easy to make power. Making water is a different story. So data, again, has provided resilience and information for us to plan our water strategy for the next 10 years, but all on the back of smart data and assured data. I think we need to be clear. There's good data and bad data. Good data is assured data. You can rely on it to set your strategy. But power and water, Kareem, are big concerns for us.
Thanks, Giles. Just before I turn to Rolake, Omar, any other thoughts on the data point once you've heard Giles?
Well, I think we're both in concert here in terms of our viewpoints. I just wanted to say, just add on to what Giles had said. If we don't get infrastructure right on day one, the cost and complexity of doing it as a brownfield project is much more, because you have a lot more constraints to work on. You have people there. I mean, just look at our experience when we see people digging up roads or adding up new telecom lines or so forth, power lines. It causes huge disruption to the city. So it's very important, as Giles mentioned up front in his comments, that you've got to bite the bullet, get it right the first time. And obviously, you can also do this based on the demand requirements. If you're building up a new city in phases, infrastructure can also follow that implementation plan based on the phasing strategy, but must get the infrastructure right on day one, because doing it later on is much more costly. You've got to do it in phases, and you've got real constraints that sometimes can be an engineering nightmare.
Great. Thanks, Umar. Just to remind the audience, please keep your questions coming, and we'll try to build it into the narrative that we develop during this panel. So please post your questions and we'll take them. Prolake, turning to you. Incredibly exciting to be working in one of Africa's mega cities, and in fact, one of my favorite cities on the continent. Maybe you can tell us a little bit in the way the Giants did about what you're up to with Lagos, your new project in Lagos.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Kareem, and great introductory takes. There's submissions from Giles and Omar. So we've been developing affordable housing. That's our main area of line of development. We're currently present in 8 countries with operating subsidiaries in 5 out of those. So Nigeria, Senegal, Cote d'Ivoire, Morocco, and Tunisia, we have subsidiaries, but we've done projects in Mauritania, Algeria, and Egypt. And I think I'm really in agreement with what has been said. It's really about finding data and numbers, but sometimes it feels that Lagos is so far behind the curve, because guess what? We haven't had a census in more than 2 decades. So I guess with our Lagos New Town project, the question is, why does Lagos need new towns? But not many people often realize the extent of the challenge that we have in this mega city. In the last 60 years, the population of the city has grown by over 2,000%. By comparison, London had 8 million people in 1960, and today it still has a population of under 10 million. Compare that to Lagos in 1960 that had less than 1 million people. Today we have at least 22 million people living in this city. So what is pretty clear is that there hasn't been enough money invested in infrastructure for that population growth, and new communities are required. And at the center of that is the need to provide infrastructure to make them function. Right now, looking at what we are trying to do, the focus is not just simply working with the government to get rid of slums, but it's actually to promote more adequate housing solutions. And it means that we need to be proactive. We need to have well-targeted public subsidies on the one hand, but well-planned municipalities. And I think we are part of the private sector clarion call that is seeking to move and encourage African governments to develop a more balanced network of cities and mega regions, so where you combine cities with small towns. The other thing I will mention is that COVID-19 has had a huge and severe impact. And I think that cities are much more vulnerable to shocks right now, but it also means that they are key to climate sustainability and green investments. One of the projects that we're really proud of is the Asaka Project in an area in Morocco called Tetouan Matil. It was developed around 6 years ago, 5,000 affordable homes. And in its history, that development is actually looking throughout the course of the life cycle to deliver up to 12,000 homes. But one of the things that really reinforced that proposition was the supported government policy in the country. And actually, through an active government policy, Morocco has managed to reduce its housing deficit significantly over the last few years. But this has not been without challenges. So if you see some of the issues we as developers are facing with Lagos New Town, it's our supply chain and construction costs. Because we also work in a market and an industry that doesn't have a thriving mortgage industry, consumer finance is almost non-existent in many parts of the African continent. It means that we need access to funding and long-term single-digit financing in terms of interest rates for developers. And then you come to the problem of trying to plug your funding plan with the construction and development cycle. And then the demand side challenges. It's a real challenges. Mortgages here, for instance, are still only available to a small percent of the population. And then there's the ultra conservative pension funds and long-term financing. There's also an issue of land acquisition. We currently have a land bank of over 15 million square meters, but in about 10 years, 15 years time, a lot of that will have run out through the planning and the development of infrastructure. And so the question is, where do we find new land? And many people often compare the strategy that cities like New York have adopted. If you can't go wide, then you go up. But the problem is the specificities of the local market here is that in our city of Lagos, high rises are not something that are actively accepted by the market. And then finally, it's around just the general planning. We know that 90% of urban areas globally are coastal. We know that 50% of the world's population live in cities. So how do we then build climate resilience in Lagos New Town as a whole? And these are some of the issues that are keeping us up at night. I think the final point I wanted to talk about that, and I can go across in more detail, is this whole issue about the broader infrastructure network. And I think it was Shakespeare that said, you know, what is a city but it's people? So when people think about cities, generally, they think of buildings and streets and skyscrapers. But one of the things that we've increasingly found is that what we do with cities can actually incentivize behavior. And it's something that I like to call the pedestrian psychology. So if I give the example of Lagos, this mega city, we've often built roads in the past without pedestrian crossings or overhead footbridges. But recently, we've started to see the development and construction of footbridges. But one thing that has perplexed the average commuter or the average driver is, why do pedestrians still not use footbridges? And so we quickly discovered that many pedestrians still cross the road because using the overhead footbridge may be seen as a losing battle, giving the scarcity of and competition for public transport. So in essence, what I'm saying is that if you create a city that features a strong transportation and rail network and a well-engineered infrastructure, then you can incentivize people towards a certain type of behavior. Because frankly, it's much faster to risk life and limb crossing the road because you're trying to catch a bus than use an overhead footbridge. So you're going to save yourself 2, 3, 5 minutes of total commute time. And so when it comes to developing for mega cities like Lagos, you have to look at the broader infrastructure network. And I think one of the things that we're trying to do with Lagos Newtown is to say we're not just an affordable housing developer, but we have to bring the total infrastructure, an integrated infrastructure ecosystem to the table. And of course, I can talk about all the consumer finance and demand challenges, but in all of this, I see both opportunity and I see a challenge for funding. I see a challenge for planning. I think we're still a bit behind the curve around utilizing and leveraging data, but that is something that I think developers like Mixstar are looking to increasingly pioneer in this market. Thank you.
Thanks, Rolake. Absolutely fascinating. Before I pick up on your invitation to quote Shakespeare and talk about infrastructure, we'll come back to that. We'll come back to that later, but I want to just pick up on 2 quick points. You talked about thinking through climate resilience. Can you give me a specific example of how that's impacting what you're doing on the ground?
Thanks very much. I think the first thing is really around our drainage systems. You know, one of the things, and people don't often have real constructive conversations on this. Nigeria, if you come to the average town or city in Nigeria today, it is flood-ridden. It is just not sustainable. So you have a historical planning environment where people have literally, both private and public sector players have literally built houses on drainage pathways. And you have this at a critical mass across huge parts of the Lagos environment. And the Lagos government, which is now much more progressive, is now looking at how it can adjust some of the mistakes that have been made in the past. But some of that you can't do without uprooting millions and millions of people from their homes, whether that's smalls or slums or actual concrete structures. So one of the things that we've said with the government is like, let's look at how in the development of these new towns, we actually create a specific focus strategy around standards, expected standards for which there are penalties around the construction and delivery of flood management systems and drainage systems. So Mixstar Africa has sort of seen itself as a market maker of sorts. Because we also sell bulk land to other developers and other players, we're delivering infrastructure in such a way we create a system which they then plug into. So we're saying to everybody, if you want access to our urban land, which has been developed, then you have to abide by these certain standards. And particularly with our sites and services products, which is one part of, essentially we're delivering service land to other developers where we provide infrastructure, the utilities, we do all the reticulations and all of that, is you plug into an existing system. Where we sell to you on service land, then you have to abide by new emerging standards that we're collaborating with the Lagos State government on. And I think that's a key part of the climate resilience issue. And that's just one example. I could give several others, but that's just one example.
Thanks, Rolake. Really, really helpful. Okay, I want to turn now to Raghav. In the previous panel with the President of the African Development Bank and the Senior Minister, I think there was a reference to a rock star, and as a Kenyan, Acorn is one of our rock star companies, developing fantastic housing for young people and students. In fact, my son, who until recently was studying in the UK, visited a friend at one of Acorn's developments and said that his accommodation in the UK was super subpar compared to what they're putting up in Nairobi. So Raghav, turning to you, you've sort of heard Giles and Rolake talk a little bit about what they're up to. Could you just give our audience a flavor of what Acorn is up to in the space in which you're so active?
Sure, Kareem, and thank you for that fantastic introduction to Acorn. And I'll be sure to pass my thanks on to your son as well. In terms of what Acorn does, our focus is to provide unparalleled, affordable, quality rental housing for the underserved segments of African society, and deliver returns to investors and shareholders. So our aim is to be a premier developer, operator, and asset manager of rental housing. That's kind of our business model is focused, maybe somewhat uniquely within the industry and the sector, primarily in the rental form of real estate versus many other developers who focus on selling off-plan apartments and other forms of real estate. Our past I would say the past 3-4 years, our focus has been very much on student accommodation, purpose-built student accommodation of the type of the standard that we see, in much more established, mature markets such as the UK, continental Europe, the US. And that's what really we're trying to bring about out here. Right in the beginning, I mentioned about the underserved segments, and one of the, based on the research that we did when we were looking to foray into this space, it was quite an eye opener for us to see the standards of accommodation that students were living in. Very much kind of ad hoc forms of housing, people, empty nesters who are kind of who are offering their vacated rooms, and sometimes let's say individuals who've kind of converted let's say slightly larger setups into what they have termed as student hostels, but not necessarily providing the type of safety, security, hygiene standards that one would expect. So, when we did that research, we identified that there was a significant opportunity at the outset, and that's what we've really moved into with a focus on, like I said, providing students a safe, secure environment where they can thrive. But of course, that's only the starting point. What we've also done is we've charted out the life cycle needs for any individual for when they might require rental housing specifically. And our aim is over time to introduce more and more products into the market, into the country, in order to be able to, again, serve those underserved segments of the population.
Great. And could you talk, Raghav, a little bit about, just because there are relatively unique aspects to how you raised funding for Acorn. Could you just dive into that a little bit?
Yeah, sure, not a problem. We in I would say early 2019, so it's been a couple of years now, we took a call to tap into the capital markets through regulated products, because for us there was, let's say, significant latent demand in the space from institutional investors for investing in transparent, regulated structures in real estate. Because obviously, there's a number of stories of how investors have, let's say, not fared so well when they've done maybe more direct forms of real estate investing. They might not necessarily have the in-house expertise to be able to deliver real estate, or maybe they've sometimes partnered with someone that was not necessarily looking to offer them the type of transparency that we were. So for us, we took a call that we wanted to go through the regulated route, and that's what we've really been doing. At the end of 2019, we launched a green bond, the first listed green bond in Kenya, which was essentially a project bond focused on providing project financing for a number of projects. Initially, this was sized at $43 million. We actually upsized this a few months ago successfully to $55 million. So we just, we had another tranche that we had to raise against, but what we decided to do was upsize that tranche by incorporating a couple of new projects into the green bond. So that that was the first foray for us, and it's been a really positive experience and really helped in let's say crowding in local investors into kind of the regulated real estate space and giving them a sense and feel of the types of product offerings, investment product offerings that are available if done, by the right issuer and with the right mindset, so to speak. And then what we did was, we like to take on challenges, and we chose 2020 to raise against a couple of real estate investment trusts. So, whilst a number of institutional investors were asking us what exactly we had consumed to take on such a challenge, we still powered through. We raised about $23 million at the start of this year. Like I said, into two REITs. One was an income REIT and the other is a development REIT. That latter vehicle is quite unique to Kenya. Kenya has regulations in place which enable the development of a development REIT, which is essentially like a development fund, a privately held development fund that we come across, or private equity development fund, which we come across a number of times, but within the overlay of REIT regulations, so it gives you some of those benefits that REITs are renowned for. So we raised $23 million at the time of launch, and subsequent to that, we've received further approvals for about $8 million as well. So that's the REITs are really the kind of fundraising vehicle now going forward, equity fundraising vehicle for doing further developments in the student accommodation space.
Thanks, Raghav. There's some questions coming through on the chat, and there's a very interesting one on which I sort of want you all to comment in a sense. And Rolaki, you sort of touched on this in a way, but let me just read it. When coming up with smart city plans, how do you approach the social, cultural aspect, given that most urbanizing cities in the developing world have a big portion of its people being migrants? So I think this is talking a little bit about nudging, right? How do you nudge behavior and so on and so forth? I don't know who wants to take a crack at this first. Hands up or go off mute if you want to be the first, otherwise I'll pick on you.
Yeah, I mean, I'll have a stab at it. We don't have a migrant issue per se like that where we are with what we're developing, but I think we have internal migration. So, I mean, most countries have an urbanization of rural to urban.
Giles, I think that's what the question meant anyway.
Yeah. Okay. So that urbanization it's a global phenomenon. It happens everywhere. I think people looking for better jobs, better opportunities, better schooling, etc. So the challenge with that is, smart cities don't come cheap. Smart cities, to a degree, need to find a model that pays their way. With us, that's attracting corporate tenants who will take up space in our office block, pay us a rental. That rental is greater than the cost of what we're borrowing money for on a yield basis. So it makes sense. We're in it for profit. I think we cannot ignore the migration, the internal migration, and I think you've got to start creating products. The problem you've got is you cannot have a have and have nots in the same environment. So either everybody has or everybody doesn't have, so to speak. So from a smart city environment, we are entering affordable accommodations in the context. There's 3 estates currently rolling out just under 10,000 residential units that are deemed affordable in the South African context. All of those are fiber connected. The uptake on that fiber network is low relative to the higher end residential suburbs, and that would be typical. You've got people coming in that don't have the same quality of smartphone. They don't have a laptop or desktop at home. But we've installed the network and the system across all of these facilities, so we can actually map the uptake of data in these environments. With the advent of 5G, it's also making it very different for us because one of the sister companies within Waterfall owns all the Comco, all the cell phone towers, and in fact owns the fiber network as well. So it's quite a captive audience that allows us, or captive market that allows us to map the data. But the urbanization is unfortunately running at a run rate greater than what we can provide solutions for, and I think that's where one would tend to look up to national government as a stakeholder or as a role player to help with that process. Because I don't think the private sector can solve all of the problems of a country. You can have a good bash at it, but you're never going to do it unless there is, it's yourself, government, and the banks, the financial institutions are all rowing in the same direction. And a lot of times as a private developer, I feel that I'm going in a completely different direction, even from the banks, especially in the sustainability space. And I'm definitely going in a different direction to national government. And I think government has its priorities and it has its objectives, but I don't know if that translates into willingness to come to the party around this internal urbanization, which is a serious number. I mean, as I spoke about water earlier, Johannesburg had a 20-year water plan, and that was based on an urbanization rate of X. We're running at 3X. So what does that do? All it does is just closes down the gap between now and when we run out of water. It doesn't do anything else, and government has to respond to that. It can't stop the urbanization. We tried that 60 years ago in South Africa, and it was a disaster. It doesn't work. It's a problem, and it's not a problem because it's a problem because it was racially based. It wasn't a case of how do you put work out into the rural areas to stop that migration. And I think we've got a small problem in Africa. If I look at what China and India is urbanizing at a significantly bigger rate than what we are, and yet they're dealing with it because central government is on board that this is a problem that's not going away.
Giles, I'll just jump in there. I mean, and of course we saw what happened in Cape Town, right? With the clock ticking down to kind of end the water and so on.
0 days. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I've taken the bait. I've taken the bait. I've come back to financing. I know it's a bugbear of yours. But I want to, before I move on, and I know, Rolake, you've got your hands up, and Omar, you're not on mute, so I think you have something to say on this. So I'll come to both of you in a second, but I want to put a question to you that I want you to think about and then answer later on before we close. And it's linked to a question that the audience have asked. So the audience question is, what are the key challenges the panel sees in terms of current urban planning regulations across Africa? Okay. Now, I know you don't all have it's a 54 countries, massive continent, so we can't have one answer for that, right? Obviously. But what I'd like you to do is come up with, if you can, an example of really good policy movement that you've seen, all right, wherever. Raghav gave us an example around D-REITs and I-REITs, right, as being a very positive development in the market. So one example of something positive and an example of something which you think in a market in which you work, it could be an obvious improvement. Okay, and I'll give you a bit of time to think about that, and I will come back to that towards the close. But let me now turn to Rolake and to Omar to comment on this issue that was raised
Yeah, I just wanted to maybe draw one or two peculiarities of the Lagos environment in terms of trying to answer that first question. I think migration is a function of several things, one of which is development. Unfortunately, we have a situation in Lagos where Nigeria as a whole, we have 37 states. Not all of them are developing or evolving in terms of urbanization at the same rate as the commercial capital. And in fact, one of the things that has been said about Lagos is that if Lagos were a country in Africa, it would probably be about the sixth or seventh largest in terms of the size of the economy. But yet, in terms of square meter, land mass, it's probably amongst the smallest states. So we're finding that the incoming migration is a function that infrastructure development and planning in Nigeria, the regional approach to development in terms of new urban cities is not something that's being actively and strategically pursued. So you end up having a situation where migration from within the West Africa sub-region or internal migration is acting as a significant burden on urban infrastructure. And this is creating a significant headache. So one of the recent initiatives that the governments have introduced is to take a regional approach to infrastructure development and planning, where you can create integrated links with transportation networks across board. And so Nigeria is divided into 6 geopolitical zones who are now pursuing regional economic development initiatives within those zones in an attempt to manage this. Now, it's not sufficient. The internally generated revenue of Lagos State as a city is significantly, I think the delta is about 6 or 7 times higher than the nearest number 2 on that list. So this is a challenge that we're going to be facing for a long time. I think that was a perspective I wanted to put. And then finally, on the issue of the haves and have-nots, we had a situation last year during the EndSARS protests, and just to highlight how some of these planning issues can end up leading to socioeconomic unrest. We had a situation last year where a key mixed-use development site where you had both commercial, residential, retail units had been the target maybe 3 or 4 times over because it sat right on the border of a slum community. Now, I need to be very careful. Now, what we're not saying is that, you know, the location of a slum right next to a highbrow mixed-use residential commercial area was the main factor behind the attacks on shops and businesses in that axis. But I think it speaks to the broader issue of how we have been planning African cities because of the exploding youth demographic in Africa and the fact that more than 70% of Nigerians, for instance, are 16 and below. There's an education problem. We need to start looking at infrastructure and housing development from a social perspective, so that when we're planning and developing cities, we're thinking about healthcare, we're thinking about education, we're thinking about public spaces, you know, and all of these things work hand in hand. So all of those things influence immigration, and immigration itself is driven by either war, conflict, poverty, terrorism, insecurity, so many other factors. So I just thought I would add that particular perspective to that question. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rolake. Can I just turn to Omar now? Omar, did you have something to add on this?
Yes, just a quick point, and I'm going to focus more on the social, cultural point of view. You know, smart cities, you know, there's this, the concept of smart cities generally is a bit hazy, means different things to different people. And of course, there's also a notion that to run smart cities, you also need smart people. But let me focus on 2 or 3 aspects of this. One is from the municipality, or if it's a private development, from the developer perspective. I think there's a change in the organization mindset on how these projects are run, and more importantly, how are these operated during the O&M phase. We spend quite a lot of time working with our clients in terms of shaping that mindset of how things need to be done differently. How do you use analytics? How do you run it? How do you cut down the manpower, or actually reshape the organization, whether it's a public or a private enterprise running that development. So I think that's one aspect. The second aspect, and I think that applies equally to Africa as it does to developing Asia, and that is education. How do you get residents in that part of smart city or development to make use and leverage the infrastructure properly, the data that you can rely on? How do you make use of that? We're working on a smart city in India. Actually, it's surrounded by an airport, where we are actually getting some of the migrant workers who are doing some of the blue collar jobs. How do you use, for example, the smart toilet properly, or how do you use functions of the smart airport and provide a better service to travelers or to users? So I think that's the second part. And the third part, on the socio-cultural part, I want to take the example of Saudi Arabia. As we all know, Saudi Arabia is embarking on a massively ambitious Vision 2030. This is a country that's going from being very conservative to a very modern, vibrant country. And this requires a huge amount of education, and this comes from the government to drive the vision for transformation for its country. And I think you need that level of socioeconomic behavioral change at different aspects, from the municipality or from the development all the way to the government, in terms of announcing its vision. And really, that's how many countries have done it, like in Singapore or other parts of Southeast Asia. So I thought I should share that example from Asia.
Thank you, Omar. Now, we only have 20 minutes left, so I'm going to be a little tougher on our panelists in terms of just being short and sharp in your responses, so we can get through as much as we can. I think we're making really excellent ground. I want to turn to two issues now. The first is infrastructure and the discussion around the interplay of infrastructure, sustainability, and your role as sort of developers on the continent. And I'm going to ask Rolake to take this away, and then ask the other panelists to jump in once she's done. Rolake, over to you.
Okay, thank you. Infrastructure is such a big topic. We could be here all day, but I'll focus on just some of what we've seen here locally and in some parts of the continent. I always say infrastructure development is this really simply just a virtuous cycle. The more of it there is, the more you can generate revenue for it, and the more that you can then invest back into infrastructure development. But one of the challenges here that we have is that government spending on infrastructure as a percentage of GDP or the total budget is always abysmally low. But the reality is that we cannot develop this continent without an integrated infrastructure system. And what exactly does that look like? So it must be linked to a broader system of financial inclusion. You need a strong regulatory and institutional framework to govern service delivery, and especially with the construction element, the quality of construction. And then you need resilient economic demand for services. And then you can add two additional elements, which is the long-term low-cost capital, which is in scarcity in this part of the world, and then the technology and innovation side. And I think all of these conditions have to hold if at least the housing revolution and infrastructure revolution here is to become a reality. And what I'm simply saying is, if you think about it, the cost for the average African consumer of accessing infrastructure services is prohibitively high, while the cost for the developer of building even just a single quality home in a location that is connected and linked to a broader infrastructure network is also high. So I think, I often hear when people say, the leapfrog that has happened in other types of infrastructure, telecoms infrastructure, and I always say you can't simply leap past brick and mortar to some sort of virtual housing industry. So because we in this part of the world are so far behind the curve, we say to governments and the public sector, first things first, do the very basic and easy stuff, and then the others follow. So is it in how you give out contracts for road construction? The quality of that delivery is key. Because once you can then do that, you then trigger a virtuous cycle of development in other areas. And people naturally gravitate towards where there is existing quality infrastructure. But the final point I will make is, and this is something that a code that we're still trying to crack, is how do we get development finance channeled into the type of integrated infrastructure thinking that we need here. And today, for instance, in our key space, in affordable housing, there is only one housing-focused development finance institution today that is Africa-focused, and that's Shelter Freak. And we know the challenges that come with accessing that. So I would like to see a lot more collaboration in terms of green financing initiatives that come into the African continent, and then how governments can support that with guarantees and enhancement structures, particularly for developers who want to access the financing and the funding. And I think there needs to be a lot more innovation and product development in just how we support that infrastructure base for the continent. But we know what the figures are. We talk about 100 billion annually over the next 10 years. And when you add the housing and the social infrastructure requirement, I think that 100 billion, you can add ×2 or ×3 to the funding requirement for infrastructure across Africa. But certainly that is how we think about it in terms of infrastructure development.
Thanks, Rolake. I'm going to, because you've opened up a couple of discussions here and you've almost brought in the financing issue into the infrastructure, which is great. I'm going to first turn to Raghav and then Giles on this. I mean, some of the techniques we've seen elsewhere, just before I come to you, Raghav, is, a securitization, right, of receivables in various formats, whether it's of sort of road network revenues and so on and so forth, or even of rental streams, right, to raise forward funding. So Raghav, to you first, how closely or not do you work with government and local authorities around master planning and infrastructure development? And how do you think about raising, I mean, you've talked about your techniques of raising money, but going forward, as you scale and super scale, how do you think about that issue?
Yeah, I mean, Kareem, our developments are typically on, let's say, 0.5 acres to an acre. We're not getting into kind of master planned communities. Our developments can be part of a community or a master plan itself, as there are a couple of instances of those. But largely our transactions when we acquire land, are, for instance, they're mostly private transactions. There are a couple of transactions that we're working on which are more with, let's say, public entities, but largely it's kind of like, as I mentioned, private transactions.
Okay, but that's an interesting insight right there, Raghav. Sorry, stop. The fact that you build what is essentially a sort of public utility, but it's used by, for example, students, right? But you don't necessarily seek to partner with universities or public authorities. You just do it yourself.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think, for now, just the setup, whether you want to look at it as in PPP setup or whether there's any framework with universities to partner with them, it's just not there. I don't think that conducive element is there at this stage. It might be there, but I think that's some way to go in the future. For us, because we're quite focused on the type of quality of product that we want to offer. We're quite focused on the pricing points that we want to offer. It just makes sense for us to right now do this on our own. So yes, there's a number of our properties that are actually providing accommodation to public universities, right? But nevertheless, as far as we're concerned, as far as our business model is concerned, it's very much a private-based enterprise, and we're able to make it work. Of course, there are challenges, as have been identified already, in terms of financing and securing the right form of financing and the right cost of financing. For that we're working with DFIs, development finance institutions, as much as possible. But it's not the easiest, and Rolake mentioned it as well. The continent that we're working in, finding access to single digit cost of financing is near on impossible. at least in local currency terms. You might find it in foreign currency terms, but then it's not something that is helpful for your business model. But it is the circumstances that we're living in, and we try to do the best that we can. We still focus on green developments, even though that does add another layer of costing. But for us, it's such an important part of the business model and what we offer to communities and societies that we still focus on it and persist with it.
Thanks, Raghav. Giles, I guess at 2,000 plus hectares and a new city, you can't take the approach that Raghav has, right? I mean, you need to be a lot more integrated into what municipalities and provinces and so on are doing as a whole. Can you talk a little bit about your journey around building into or being part of the whole infrastructure story, and also about financing?
Yeah, I'll pick on the start with the first one. So we are essentially building a new town, and a new town has to have connection and integration with the old town. So we've spent heavily on infrastructure, as we've spoken before. But one of the challenges we have especially is that you have a provincial interface. So we have a city level interface, you have a provincial interface and a national interface. And we unfortunately here, those three are not aligned. So for example, underwater or even waste, one which came up is that at a record of decision point, which is at provincial level. So our ROD for Waterfall says we have to burn fire burns. We have to burn on a 3-year cycle all undeveloped land in order to it's just good land husbandry. The city says absolutely not allowed to burn, and if you burn, you'll get a fine. So now, who's more important, the city or the province? Then one has to then go back to the National Water Act and the national acts to see, where do we go? So if we burn it, we get a fine. If we don't burn it, we get a fine. So you're back to this position where, for Africa to move forward, it's not just government as a inverted commas. Government then sits with multiple tiers, and those also tiers, whether it's roads or fire or water, to a degree don't talk to each other. So we have a situation where we built a bridge over a national freeway. The bridge is owned by us. We built it with the road on top. We handed the road to the city, but it goes over a national freeway underneath. Well, for 3 years, we haven't been able to hand the asset over, which is part of our asset swap. So here the infrastructure, the developer develops infrastructure and then hands it back to the authorities in order to offset bulk contributions. So we build things as opposed to writing checks. Well, here we've got a situation where we can't hand the road over because the two parties are in a dispute over a road that's got nothing to do with us. So, infrastructure is key. Infrastructure is what makes this tick. I spent nearly 15 years in Dubai, where you are now, Kareem, and the infrastructure is what makes that city tick. It's thinking 20 years out. And we tend in this country, especially and potentially the continent, to not think 20 years out on infrastructure. We think a year out or 2 years out. We build a road to the end of the street rather than 5 kilometers further to unlock further developments. And then, so, integrating into a network that's not yours. So in Waterfall, every road, pipe, and cable is designed and built by ourselves. But at some point, we have to tie all of those into a greater network, the provincial network, the grid. And that's potentially where we start running into problems, because we've got two power connections. One goes to the state utility, Eskom. The other one goes to the city. So they're actually, the problem we've got is they've got two different specs in relation to the integration. So it does add these layers of complexity. And then on the financing side, I think we've got a very mature financing environment where we are in South Africa regarding commercial buildings. End user finance is readily understood from a mortgage perspective, so we don't face the similar problems that Roleke faces. And having our buyers, our apartment buyers, getting bonds, mortgages. But it's still a challenge, because I still think the funding model is slightly antiquated in that it doesn't actually price in the quality of the underlying asset. So the cost of debt, your WACC, your weighted average cost of capital from your providers, is a combination of how good my corporate ESG scorecard is and the strength of my tenant's balance sheet to pay the rent. At no point is the bank actually looking at the actual asset that's being funded, the bricks and mortar, to say it's a good, bad, or indifferent building. They don't have an opinion. And that's quite scary, because the reality is the bank owns that building until that debt is settled. So as a REIT, we carry, a healthy amount of debt, because that gives us better returns. So we always have debt against assets. We don't have intention of paying those assets off. So technically the bank's on the hook for many years on that asset, yet they don't have an opinion on the actual asset. So that's the financing part that I find difficult, because they're essentially lending you money on the strength of the corporate ESG and balance sheet, the tenant's ESG and balance sheet, but the meat and the sandwich is not getting airtime from the banks. So yeah, I've got a love-hate relationship, unfortunately, with the financial institutions. I love them because I need them to build, but I think they can be better. I think they can be a more engaging and a stakeholder in Africa in helping us get where we need to get. We can't do anything without the banks, just like government. And so if you have two ambivalent type of stakeholders in your process, it makes life quite difficult, because you're dealing with market forces on one side, and at the same time, you're actually battling with the guys who should be helping you get things across the line.
Thanks, Jazz. I think we have, I've seen the MC online, but I think we have 5 more minutes. So I'm sure I'll be cut off when we run out of time. It's ironic, because obviously in Eastern Africa, we have the opposite problem to you, Giles, in that they focus only on the asset and not on the underlying cash flows, which is really interesting to see how banks work differently. I think that in the last few minutes that we have, I should just make one point. Although the infrastructure gap in Africa is still massive, for those of us who've been on the continent for the last 15 or 20 years, we know it's massively better too, okay? In many cities across the continent. Lagos is one, Nairobi certainly is another, where there have been significant improvements in the overall road network, for example. So the story on infrastructure, I think, is far from over, but it is improving, and of course the role of China there, which is a whole different debate, has been critical. Now, in these last few minutes, I want to turn to the question I left with all of you, right? And Omar, for you, I might tweak it a little bit, okay, around smart cities. So firstly, for you, a question first, Omar, but only in a minute. What are the places in Africa that you think are looking most at smart cities, and what can governments do to incentivize embracing smart city technology? But just in a minute, sorry.
Right. Kareem, Africa is a huge continent, huge development opportunities, fastest growing, second only to Asia. So obviously, smart city is a relevant topic across the continent. But obviously, your big cities, be it Lagos, Nairobi, even Kigali, which is a city of 1 million, but I understand in the next few years, very quickly will grow out to 5 million perhaps. So huge amount of opportunities there. I'm just going to spend 20 seconds or 30 seconds of my time on saying a good design can optimize the construction cost, can optimize the time. We talked about housing. I think the housing cost in Africa is still high, relatively per square meter. There are opportunities to cut it down by using better technology. You certainly have the volume in Africa, but it also needs a nurturing, enabling environment from the government to make permitting easier, land costs, mortgages, all the stuff the other panelists talked about. I think these are all good, sort of dimensions that need to be looked at. And if those enabling environment can be put together, surely there's a business case for a lot of smart cities in different countries across the continent.
Thanks, Omar. Raghav, turning to you, the positive and the negative policy bits. Anything to contribute on that?
No, I think from a positive standpoint, you mentioned it earlier about the fact that we've got regulations for something like a D-REIT, and to me, the more innovations that are encouraged by regulators or government authorities, particularly within the capital market space, I think that's something that could really open up a world of opportunities. Giles was speaking of as well.
Yeah, was going to say that addresses Giles's point, right, around access to finance.
Yeah, exactly. Because really what we felt is that it's if you look at kind of the history of time and the development of major cities, what you'll find is that it's the being able to tap into retail in the retail investor base that gives the private sector the access to be able to fulfill their ambitions, and that's something that we'd like to see more and more of.
Thanks. Rolake, 20 seconds.
Okay, well, I will say that for me, the regulation is key, and particularly pension funds. We have ultra conservative pension funds in this market. We're sitting on a treasure pot, which is untapped. And I think just that risk reward and them being able to get their heads around it. And why is this important? We have low dependency ratios on the continent. That pot is going to be around for a very long time. So get the pensions pot done, consolidate the land registry, automate it, and support developers in accessing finance.
Thank you. That's a great point. That's a great point. I think we've run out of time. Giles, I think you did ventilate about some of the issues around central and local and provincial government. Anything in 10 seconds to add?
Yeah, I think Africa, as we said, has got incredible opportunity, but I think we sometimes become our own worst enemies in that we tend to overregulate at a governmental level. I think private sector has a lot. Don't see us as the enemy, see us as a partner. Don't see us as capitalists and hungry. We've got to make money, but we also make, we're able to bring that expertise to the table. So it's partnerships. It's always been partnerships. It has been partnerships, and it will continue to be partnerships. And I think that is the crux of unlocking this new urbanism in a sustainable and smart way.
Thank you. I think we brought this to a conclusion just in time. Allow me, before I hand over to the MC, to thank Rolake, Giles, Raghav, and Omar for an absolutely fantastic contribution to this panel. I've learned a lot just listening to you, and I'm sure the audience has as well. So thanks very much, and over to the MC.